Hello, welcome to the Heartbreak Stories channel. Today's story is about a man who built everything in silence and one evening overheard the person he'd given it all to throw it away with a single phone call. Now let's listen.
I overheard my wife tell her ex she still loved him at a dinner party I cooked for. I left that night without a word. What she didn't know was that her entire business existed because of one signature. Mine. My name is Carter Ellison. I'm 48 years old, and I run a logistics company out of Columbus, Ohio. Ellison Freight Solutions, 22 trucks, 31 employees, contracts with 3 regional distribution centers. Nothing glamorous, just reliable, profitable, and completely built by my own 2 hands over 19 years. I mention that not to brag, but because it matters later. Everything I'm about to tell you connects back to who does the building and who just stands in front of the finished wall and takes the photo. Lydia and I have been married for 16 years. She was a business coach. Specifically, she targeted women entrepreneurs, ran workshops, sold online courses, did keynote speeches at regional conferences. Elevate Her was the brand. Her face was everywhere. Podcast thumbnails, LinkedIn banners, Instagram reels where she talked about breaking the ceiling while wearing blazers that cost more than my first truck payment. And she was good at it. I'll give her that. Charismatic. Smart in the way that looks effortless from the outside. What nobody saw was the infrastructure behind the curtain. I did. I noticed things about Brian long before that evening. Brian Thatcher, my supposed best friend since college. We'd hunted together, watched games together. I'd been the best man at his wedding. But somewhere in the last year, his questions had gotten too specific, too pointed. You mention anything to Lydia about the quarterly review? Or you thinking of expanding the fleet? Little things. At the time, I chalked it up to curiosity. Later, I understood it differently. The evening it all came apart was a Thursday in late October. Lydia was hosting a small dinner at our house, a celebration for a milestone in her coaching business. A 100-member online community. I grilled steaks on the back deck, refilled glasses, made sure everything ran smooth. The good husband, the reliable furnace. Around 8 o'clock, I stepped inside to grab another bottle of wine from the basement. Coming back up the stairs, I heard Lydia's voice from the hallway, just off the kitchen. She was on the phone, voice low, but not low enough. He's steady. I'll give him that, she was saying with a laugh that I didn't recognize. Too loose. Too easy. But steady isn't exciting, Blake. You know that better than anyone. He folds his receipts. He color codes his filing cabinet. The man labels his label maker. A pause. Then, softer, I still love you. I never stop. I stood at the bottom of that staircase for a full 10 seconds. The wine bottle was cold in my hand. The dinner noise drifted in from outside. Silverware, laughter, someone's kid chasing the dog across the yard. I walked back upstairs, set the bottle on the kitchen counter, and went out to the deck. Refilled glasses. Smiled when someone made a joke. Cleared plates when the evening wound down. Brian caught my eye once near the end of the night, gave me a small nod across the table. I nodded back. Neither of us said anything, but I filed that look away like a document I knew I'd need later. After the guests left, Lydia ran the dishwasher and told me it had been a great night. I agreed. She went upstairs. I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and a legal pad, writing 3 columns. What I knew, what I suspected, and what I needed to confirm. By midnight, I had a list. By 1 in the morning, I had a plan. I went upstairs, took my duffel from the closet shelf, and packed quietly. I left my wedding ring on the nightstand, not as a statement, just because it no longer fit the version of me that was walking out the door. I tore a page off the legal pad and wrote 7 words. I heard you. Don't bother explaining it. I folded it under a phone charger. I locked the front door behind me, loaded the duffel into my truck, and drove to the furnished apartment I'd quietly leased 3 weeks earlier, because I'd heard enough of those pointed questions from Brian, and something in me had started preparing before I even admitted it to myself. I didn't feel broken. I felt clear, like a fog had finally lifted off the highway, and I could see exactly where the road was going. The next morning, I called my attorney, Robert Dean, and told him it was time. He already knew what that meant. We'd spoken twice in the past month. He said, "The paperwork is ready. Say the word." I said the word. People always assumed Lydia built Elevate Her from scratch. She let them assume that. It made for a better story. The self-made woman, the bootstrap brand, the hustle narrative she sold in every keynote. And she was convincing. I'll give her that much. What she never mentioned in those keynotes was the name on the original LLC filing. Mine. Let me back up 3 years. Lydia had the vision, the voice, and the audience instinct. What she didn't have was clean financials. Her first marriage had ended badly. A business partnership gone sideways, a judgment lien still sitting on her personal credit, and a tax liability she'd been quietly chipping away at for years. When she wanted to launch Elevate Her as a formal business entity, she ran into walls. The banks weren't interested. 2 investors she approached backed out when they pulled her credit report. So she came to me. Just until I get established, she told me one evening at the kitchen table, spreading out her notes like she was presenting to a board. I need a clean channel. You set up the LLC, hold the initial contracts, and once the revenue is stable, we transition everything into my name. I agreed. Because I loved her, and because I believed her, and because at 45 years old, I was apparently still capable of mistaking a business arrangement for a romantic gesture. I filed the LLC, Ellison Advisory Group, in my name. I leased the original office space. I opened the business accounts, signed the vendor contracts, and built the compliance structure from the ground up. I paid the web developers, the graphic designer, the first marketing agency she hired. When she needed a clean channel for her initial investor round, a group of 3 women who didn't want their names on anything public yet, I filtered $140,000 through Ellison Advisory's accounts because Lydia's name still couldn't touch a funding document without triggering flags. She was the face. I was the frame the face hung on. And buried in the operating agreement, on page 19, was a clause I drafted with Robert Dean during those early weeks. Standard language. Lydia had called it when she initialed it. She'd been in a hurry that day, heading to a workshop in Cincinnati, and she'd flipped through the pages fast, pen moving before she finished reading. The clause read, in plain terms, that in the event of separation or dissolution of the partnership arrangement, all intellectual property, licensing rights, and fiduciary authority reverted to the originating signatory. Me. She never asked about it again. Why would she? I was the reliable furnace. I didn't pull surprises. What Lydia also didn't know was what I'd discovered about her finances 11 months ago. I've been reviewing the quarterly reconciliation for Ellison Advisory, routine, something I did every quarter when I noticed a pattern in the outgoing transfers. 11 payments over 9 months, each between $3,800 and $6,200, all routed to a consulting entity called BF Strategic Resources. The registration on that LLC traced back to a P.O. box in Indianapolis. Blake Fenwick's area code. I didn't confront her. I printed the records, put them in a folder, and called Robert the next day. Then I called a contact I had at a regional accounting firm and asked him to take a quiet look at the transfers from a compliance standpoint. His assessment came back in 2 weeks. The payments lacked any corresponding service documentation. No contracts, no deliverables, no invoices that held up. In the eyes of the IRS, they looked like personal distributions disguised as business expenses. I filed that folder in my desk drawer and kept building the case. There was one more piece I'd put in motion 8 months ago. A competitor to Elevate Her had been quietly gaining traction in the Midwest market. A coaching platform called Groundwork Leadership with a cleaner curriculum and a stronger corporate client pipeline. I'd invested $85,000 through a third-party holding account, no name attached. The founder was a woman named Patricia Hale, a former corporate trainer who had the substance Lydia had always borrowed from others. Patricia didn't know who her silent investor was. She just knew the funding had arrived and the terms were fair. By the time Lydia's brand started losing clients, Groundwork Leadership would be ready to absorb them. That morning after I called Robert and gave him the word, I drove to the office, unlocked Suite 204, and sat at my desk. The morning light came through the blinds in clean, even strips. Mara, my office manager, arrived at 8:15, set a coffee on my desk without being asked, and said nothing about the fact that I looked like I hadn't slept. The Dean files, I told her. Everything in the red folder. He needs it by noon. She picked up the folder without hesitation. At the door, she paused. Carter, you doing okay? I took a sip of the coffee. I'm doing exactly what needs to be done. She nodded once and left. I opened my laptop and began drafting the first of several notifications. Account access changes, licensing transfers, vendor redirections, each one precise, each one documented, each one irreversible. Lydia thought she'd outgrown the man who folded his receipts. She was about to find out what those receipts were worth. I want to talk about Brian Thatcher for a minute, because he deserves more than a footnote. Brian and I have been friends since our junior year at Ohio State. We'd driven cross-country together twice. I'd helped him move 3 times, including the ugly one after his first divorce. I was the man he called at 2 in the morning when his father passed. For 26 years, I thought I knew exactly who Brian Thatcher was. Turns out I knew the performance, not the man. The first real sign came last February, 8 months before the dinner party. Lydia had mentioned, casually at breakfast, that she was thinking about restructuring her pricing model. A private detail, something she hadn't posted about or discussed with her team yet. 3 days later, Brian brought it up over lunch. Lydia thinking about raising her rates? He asked, reaching for his burger like it was nothing. Heard it's a smart move in that market. I kept my face neutral. Where do you hear that? He shrugged. One of those things. You know how it is. I didn't know. That's exactly the problem. I spent the next 6 weeks testing him. I told Brian 4 separate pieces of information, each one plausible, each one slightly different, each one told to him alone. A rumor that I was in talks to acquire a smaller freight company in Dayton, that I was considering pulling Ellison Advisory's financial support from Lydia's brand, that I'd had a disagreement with my largest distribution client, that I was looking at commercial real estate near the airport. All 4 came back to me within 10 days. 2 through Lydia. 1 through a mutual acquaintance. 1 Brian referenced himself, awkwardly, a week later, testing whether I'd react. I didn't react. I just updated the file. What Brian didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had a meeting that same week with Patricia Hale, the founder of Groundwork Leadership. We met at a coffee shop in Dublin, Ohio, 30 minutes outside Columbus. Patricia was sharp, prepared, and frustrated with the slow pace of her company's growth. I slid a single page across the table, a term sheet for an $85,000 investment, no strings, no board seat, no public disclosure. She looked up from the page. Who are you exactly? Someone who believes in your curriculum, I replied, and someone who thinks the market is about to have an opening. She signed 2 weeks later. I never told her my name was connected to the competing brand. I didn't need to. Patricia would build her business on her own merits. I was just removing the obstacle. Back at home, I kept my routine unchanged. Drove the same roads. Grilled the same steaks on Friday nights. Watched football with Brian on Sundays, and said nothing when he steered conversation toward my business plans. I fed him small, useless details and watched them travel. The night of the dinner party, I watched Brian across the table while Lydia laughed at someone's story. He caught my eye once, gave me that small confirming nod. Everything's fine, nothing's changed, and I nodded back. What he didn't know was that the previous Monday, I'd had coffee with Robert Dean and walked through the full document chain one final time. Every piece was in order. The LLC reversion clause, the IP contingency language, the financial transfer records linking Blake Fenwick's entity to Lydia's business accounts. Robert had submitted a quiet disclosure to the IRS compliance desk 48 hours earlier. Not a formal complaint, just a documented referral that would create a paper trail and trigger a routine inquiry. Brian's role in this was almost finished. One last piece remained. The morning after I left, I called him. 7:15 a.m. He picked up on the second ring, voice careful. Carter, hey, I heard you weren't home last night. Lydia called me. She did, I replied. I figured she would. A pause. You doing okay, man? I let a moment pass before answering. Brian, I know what you've been doing. I've known since February. I tested you 4 times, and you failed every one. Another pause, longer this time. I don't need an explanation. I just need you to know that the information you've been passing along has helped me build a case that's now in the hands of my attorney and, as of Tuesday, the IRS. The silence on his end was total. I'm not your enemy, I continued, but I'm not your friend anymore either. And the next time Lydia calls you looking for information about me, you've got nothing to give her, because I've already moved everything that matters. I ended the call, set the phone on the desk, and went back to my coffee. Brian didn't call back. He never did. Lydia didn't call me the morning after I left. That told me everything about how she'd read our marriage. She assumed my silence was temporary, that I'd gone to Brian's place to sulk, that I'd be back by Sunday with a quiet apology and a willingness to pretend nothing had happened. She was still operating on the old Carter model, the one that held his tongue and refilled the wine glasses and asked no uncomfortable questions. That model had been discontinued. The first alert hit her inbox at 9:17 a.m., an automated notification from the business banking platform. Administrative access credentials updated. Contact your account administrator for assistance. I know the exact time because Robert sent me the confirmation log. She probably assumed it was a glitch. The second notification arrived at 9:41. Her vendor payment portal had been suspended pending account review. The third, 11 minutes later, came from the licensing registry. Trademark usage rights for the Elevate Her brand name were under administrative review and temporarily restricted. By 10:30, she called Robert Dean's office. His receptionist told her that Mr. Dean represented an opposing party in a matter involving her business and could not take her call. She called me at 10:47. I let it go to voicemail. The call that broke her composure came at 11:15 from Dennis Holt, her own attorney. I was sitting in my office when Robert texted me. Her counsel is on the phone with her now. Expect noise. I could only imagine. Dennis Holt was a competent enough attorney, but he was used to handling Lydia's routine contract work, vendor agreements, workshop liability waivers. He wasn't prepared for what he was reading when he pulled up the document chain Robert had filed that morning. Lydia called me again at 11:22. This time I answered. Carter. Her voice was tight, controlled. She was working hard to keep it that way. Dennis is telling me there's some kind of filing with our business accounts, that you've made changes. I need you to explain what's happening. I'd say Dennis is doing a pretty accurate job of explaining it, I replied. This is insane. The control slipped a notch. You can't just restructure my business without telling me. It's not your business, Lydia. I cut in, voice even. It never was legally. You initialed the operating agreement on page 19. You want me to describe the clause, or would you rather Dennis walk you through it? Silence. Then, you did this on purpose. From the beginning, I filed that clause the same week you asked me to build you a clean funding channel because your credit couldn't hold a business license. I wasn't hiding it. You just didn't read it. The silence that followed was a different kind. Not angry, but hollow. Carter, there's also a matter of 11 months of transfers to BF Strategic Resources. I added, no service contracts, no deliverables. The IRS compliance desk received documentation on Tuesday. That part isn't me. That's just math. I heard her breath go shallow. Blake's going to have a hard few months, I continued. And Lydia, Dennis is going to tell you the clause is airtight. Save yourself the legal fees. I ended the call before she could respond. Robert texted me 4 minutes later. Her attorney just called. He's seen the reversion clause. He's not challenging it. Then, a moment later, he said, and I quote, your client does thorough work. I set the phone down, looked out the window at the Columbus skyline, and allowed myself one quiet moment of satisfaction. Not triumph, just the clean, solid feeling of a structure holding exactly the weight it was designed to hold. Then I picked up the phone and called Patricia Hale at Groundwork Leadership. Patricia, I said when she answered, the market just opened up. I think you're going to want to reach out to a few coaching clients in the Columbus area this week. She paused. Any particular reason? Let's just say a competitor recently underwent a significant change in management, I replied. Be ready to move. She was. I almost felt sorry for the man. Almost. His name was Ray Kowalski, a retired Columbus PD detective who'd gone private about 4 years back. Lydia found him through a referral from a woman in her coaching network, someone who'd used him in a custody dispute. Ray had a decent reputation for discretion and solid documentation. Under normal circumstances, he probably was a good hire. These weren't normal circumstances. I found out she'd hired him on a Wednesday, 8 days after I left. The tip came from an unexpected source, Dennis Holt's paralegal, a woman named Carol who had done contract filing work for Ellison Advisory the previous year. Carol didn't owe Lydia anything, and apparently she'd overheard enough of a phone call to put two and two together. She sent me a single text. Heads up, someone's asking questions about you around the freight yards. I thanked her, called Robert, and we agreed to do nothing. Let Kowalski dig. I had nothing to hide. My books were clean, my business was legitimate, and every personal account I held was exactly what it appeared to be. If anything, I was curious what he'd find when he started pulling on the threads that led back to Lydia. It took him 11 days. He called Lydia on a Thursday afternoon. Robert's contact at Dennis Holt's office passed along the detail and asked for an in-person meeting. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Afterward, Lydia called Dennis in what the paralegal described as a controlled panic. Robert laid it out for me the next morning over coffee in my office. Kowalski had found nothing actionable on me. My freight company was clean. Ellison Advisory's financials were documented and compliant. My personal accounts showed nothing unusual. He'd interviewed 3 of my employees, 2 of my distribution clients, and a neighbor. Everyone said the same thing. Carter Ellison was organized, direct, and kept his professional and personal life clean. But Kowalski was thorough, and thorough men follow every thread, not just the ones they're paid to follow. In reviewing the financial connections between Ellison Advisory and Overheard, he'd pulled transaction records going back 30 months. He'd found BF Strategic Resources before I even had to point anyone toward it. 11 payments, no service documentation, originating from a business account that technically ran through my company's infrastructure. Robert slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a summary Kowalski had apparently prepared for Lydia, an honest professional's disclosure that what he'd uncovered could create significant legal exposure for his client, not the target. He told her straight, Robert said, leaning back. Professional obligation. He couldn't sit on documentation of potential financial misconduct just because she was the one writing his checks. I read through the summary. Clean, methodical work. I actually respected it. She tried to pay him to bury it, Robert added. I looked up. He declined, refunded half his retainer, and walked. Robert picked up his coffee. The documentation is now in his files. If anyone subpoenas his records in connection with the IRS inquiry, it's all there. I set the folder down and looked out the window for a moment. Lydia had hired a man to find dirt on me, and he'd come back with a shovel full of her own. There was a particular justice in that which required no commentary. Does she know the IRS referral is already active? I asked. She does now, Robert replied. Dennis told her yesterday. She's got bigger problems than the reversion clause at this point. I nodded, finished my coffee, and moved on to the next item on my list. There was still one conversation I hadn't had yet, one that I'd been expecting for about a week. Blake Fenwick showed up the following Tuesday. He called first, which surprised me. I'd expected him to show up unannounced, all chest and bravado. Instead, I got a voicemail, careful, measured, the voice of a man who'd been coached on what to say. He wanted to talk, man to man, clear the air. I texted back one line, Tuesday, 10 a.m. My office. He arrived 3 minutes early, which told me he was nervous. Blake Fenwick was taller than I'd imagined from the financial records, broad-shouldered, good haircut, the kind of man who'd been told he was impressive often enough to believe it completely. He wore a sport coat over a collared shirt and shook my hand with the practiced firmness of someone who'd read a book about first impressions. I offered him coffee. He accepted. I poured 2 cups and sat across from him at the small conference table, not behind my desk. Equal ground. I wanted him comfortable enough to talk. He started with an apology. Vague, nonspecific, the kind that acknowledges discomfort without admitting anything. I know this situation has been hard on everyone, he offered, wrapping both hands around the mug. I never wanted things to go this way. How did you want them to go? I asked, genuinely curious. He shifted. Lydia and I have a history. I won't pretend otherwise. But what's happening with her business, the account freezes, the legal filings, that's affecting real people. Her team, her clients. Her team has options, I replied. Her clients have options. That's actually something I've already been thinking about. He looked uncertain, like he'd expected a different response. He pressed forward. Carter, I'm asking you, man to man, to consider stepping back from whatever legal action you've set in motion. Give her a chance to rebuild. Whatever happened between you two, she doesn't deserve to lose everything. I let a moment pass. Then I stood up, walked to the side cabinet, and picked up a manila folder. I sat on the table in front of him and sat back down. That's a summary of 11 payments from Lydia's business account to BF Strategic Resources over the past 11 months, I said calmly. No service contracts. No deliverables. The IRS compliance desk received documentation on that transaction trail 9 days ago. That inquiry is now active, Blake, and your LLC is the named recipient. He stared at the folder without opening it. I didn't file that to hurt Lydia, I continued. I filed it because it's accurate. The money moved. The documentation doesn't exist. That's not a marital dispute. That's a compliance issue, and it existed before I walked out of that house. His jaw tightened. The confident posture was still there, but something behind his eyes had gone very quiet. You should get an attorney, I said, not unkindly. A good one. Not for the conversation you thought you were coming here to have, but for the one the IRS is eventually going to want. Blake stood slowly, left the coffee untouched, and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he turned, and for a moment I thought he might say something worth hearing. Instead he just looked at me with an expression caught between anger and the dawning recognition that he'd walked into the wrong room. He left without another word.
Blake walked in thinking he had leverage, and Carter didn't even flinch. That kind of calm under pressure isn't something you perform. That's who you actually are.
I cleared the cups, filed the folder back in the cabinet, and checked my watch. 11:14. I had a call with Patricia Hale at noon. She'd already fielded inquiries from 3 of Lydia's former corporate clients. Groundwork leadership was moving fast. I wasn't angry at Blake Fenwick. Anger would have required me to care about him personally. I didn't. He was simply a variable in an equation that had already been solved. Lydia had a gift for identifying talent in other people and then failing to invest in it. She could spot potential from across a room. It was one of the things that made her an effective coach, ironically, but the moment that potential became useful to her operation, she stopped developing it and started consuming it. His name was Joel Tanner, 29 years old, a curriculum developer Lydia had hired 14 months ago to build the structured content behind her online courses. Joel was the reason Elevate Her had any intellectual backbone at all. He wrote the frameworks she delivered from stage. He built the workbooks her clients called transformational. He managed the course platform, the member portal, and the email automation sequences that drove 40% of her revenue. Lydia paid him $52,000 a year and introduced him to clients as my content guy. I met Joel twice at company events. Both times he'd struck me as someone doing 3 jobs while being compensated for one, with the particular quiet patience of a man who knows he's being underused but hasn't yet decided what to do about it. After I left, I reached out to him directly. Not immediately. I waited 10 days until the first wave of account disruptions had settled and it was clear the legal situation wasn't reversing. I sent a short email from my personal account. Joel, Carter Ellison here. If you're open to a conversation, I have something worth discussing. No pressure either way. He replied within 2 hours. We met for lunch the following Thursday at a restaurant downtown. He didn't waste time. I've been watching what's happening with the business accounts, he said, cutting into his sandwich. The platform locks, the licensing issues. I figured something structural was going on. Something structural, I agreed. The brand is going through a significant transition. The content infrastructure and the client relationships are going to need a new home. He set down the sandwich. What kind of new home? I've been in conversations with Patricia Hale at Groundwork Leadership, I replied. She's building a curriculum-based coaching platform with real corporate traction. She needs someone who can architect the content system from the ground up, not patch together someone else's framework, but build it clean. Joel was quiet for a moment. What's the offer? $78,000 base, equity participation after 12 months, and your name on the content framework you build. Not content guy, architect. He picked up his sandwich again. When do I start? I smiled. After you resign properly and serve your notice. I don't poach, I recruit. There's a difference. He gave 2 weeks' notice the following Monday. Lydia called him into her home office and spent 40 minutes trying to convince him to stay, offering a raise she couldn't fund from accounts she no longer controlled. He was polite, professional, and immovable. He called me afterward. She cried. He said, not unkindly. I felt bad about that part. You're allowed to feel bad, I replied. Leaving is still the right move. The larger blow came 3 days after Joel's departure. Hartfield Corporate Group, a regional business development firm that had been Lydia's anchor client for 2.5 years, representing roughly $180,000 in annual contract value, sent a formal notice of non-renewal. No personal statement, no phone call, just a clean 2-paragraph letter from their legal department, citing a review of vendor compliance documentation and a decision to transition to a new service provider. The new service provider was Groundwork Leadership. Patricia handled it with complete professionalism. She didn't gloat, didn't reference the transition publicly, just announced a new corporate partnership on her company's LinkedIn page. The post had 340 engagements by end of day. Lydia posted nothing. Her social accounts had gone quiet 10 days earlier, around the time her scheduled live streams stopped appearing and her domain redirected to a holding page. Robert called me that evening with a final update on the Kowalski documentation. The private investigator's files had been formally requested by the IRS field office handling the compliance inquiry. Blake Fenwick's attorney had entered an appearance, which meant Blake was now managing his own legal exposure independently from Lydia. The machine was running exactly as designed. I sat on the small balcony of my apartment that evening with a glass of water and the particular stillness of a man who has finished a large, complicated piece of work and can finally put down the tools. Not triumphant, just finished. Patricia texted at 9:15. Joel's first week was exceptional. Thank you for the introduction. I typed back. He did that himself. I just opened the door. The conference was called Midwest Business Forward. 3 days of panels, workshops, and networking at a convention center in downtown Columbus. I've been invited to speak on operational infrastructure for service businesses, which was not exactly the kind of topic that fills a room with excitement. But the organizers had wanted substance over spectacle this year. I arrived early, as I always do. Checked the AV setup, walked the room, drank bad conference coffee, and reviewed my notes, which I didn't actually need because I've been living this material for 19 years. The room held about 90 people when the panel began. My co-panelists were a regional banker and a commercial real estate developer. Both competent, both considerably louder than me. I let them set the tone and spoke when I had something specific to add. That approach always reads better to the audience than the man who talks most. 30 minutes in, I noticed her near the back. Lydia had come in quietly, taken an aisle seat 2 rows from the rear. She wore a gray blazer I didn't recognize, new but understated. No lapel mic, no conference lanyard, no speaker badge. Just an attendee. In a conference room she would have walked into 6 months ago, expecting to be introduced from the stage. I didn't lose the thread of what I was saying. I finished my point about infrastructure documentation, took a question from the front row, and answered it the same way I would have if she weren't there. But I was aware of her, the way you're aware of weather. After the panel, the networking portion began. 3 of Lydia's former corporate clients made their way toward me within the first 20 minutes. Introductions I hadn't arranged, conversations that started themselves. Hartfield's operations director shook my hand and said Patricia Hale's onboarding process had been the smoothest vendor transition they'd experienced in 5 years. 2 others asked about Ellison Advisory's consulting services, apparently on a referral from someone in Patricia's network. I handled each conversation the same way, direct, specific, unhurried. No referencing Lydia. No explaining the backstory. Just the work. At one point, I turned to pick up a fresh glass of water from the side table and found Lydia standing 6 feet away. Not approaching, just present. She looked like a woman who had walked into a building she used to own and found the locks had been changed and the furniture rearranged, and everyone inside seemed perfectly comfortable with the new arrangement. Our eyes met. I gave her a small, neutral nod, the kind you'd give anyone you recognized in a professional setting. She didn't return it. She looked away first, adjusted the strap of her bag, and a few minutes later, I noticed she'd moved toward the exit. Joel Tanner was across the room, deep in conversation with Patricia Hale and two attendees from a corporate HR department. He was using his hands when he talked, animated in a way I'd never seen at the Lydia events. The way people get when they're doing work they actually believe in. I watched that for a moment. It was the detail that stayed with me longer than anything else that day. Not the former clients, not Lydia's exit, not the business cards I collected or the follow-up meetings I scheduled. Just Joel Tanner, finally in a room where someone had bothered to read his name tag correctly. On the drive back to the apartment, I got a call from Robert. The IRS inquiry had formally expanded. Blake Fenwick's entity, BF Strategic Resources, was now under active examination. The field office had requested documentation going back 36 months. Blake's attorney is already talking about a cooperation agreement, Robert said. That's between him and them, I replied. It could implicate Lydia on the transfer documentation. That's also between them and her, I said. We've done what we needed to do. The rest isn't ours. Robert paused. Most people in your position would feel something about that. I thought about it honestly for a moment. I feel like a man who built a solid structure and then walked away from it before it fell on him, I said. That's enough. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in mid-January. Franklin County Courthouse, Courtroom 7, the one with the water-stained ceiling tile in the back left corner that nobody had gotten around to replacing. I'd been in that building twice before on business matters. It smelled the same both times, old paper and industrial cleaner, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult things get decided. Robert and I arrived together. Dennis Holt was already at the opposing table with Lydia, who wore a charcoal blazer and kept her eyes on the documents in front of her. She didn't look at me when I sat down. I didn't look at her with anything more than passing acknowledgement. The judge was a compact woman in her late 50s named Patricia Owens. No nonsense, efficient, the kind of judge who had read every document before the hearing began and didn't need anyone to explain what she was holding. I appreciated that immediately. Dennis Holt opened with a motion to contest the IP reversion clause, arguing that Lydia had signed the document under an incomplete understanding of its implications. Judge Owens let him finish, then asked him two direct questions about the circumstances of the signing. Dennis answered them carefully. Judge Owens made a note and moved on. Robert presented the full document chain, the original LLC filing, the operating agreement, the initial addendum, the dated and notarized reversion clause. He laid it out the way I would have laid out a freight route. Clean sequence, no gaps, no ambiguity. Then came a moment Robert had prepared me for. Judge Owens asked me directly whether I was seeking financial compensation from Lydia personally, alimony, asset division, anything beyond the business documentation already filed. I said no. Dennis looked up from his papers. Lydia finally looked at me. Mr. Ellison, the judge said, with the careful precision of someone who wanted the record to be exact, you are voluntarily waiving any personal financial claims against your spouse in this proceeding? That's correct, Your Honor, I replied. I'm not here for her personal assets. I'm here to confirm that what was legally mine remains legally mine. A brief silence. Judge Owens made another note. Dennis leaned toward Lydia and said something in a low voice. She shook her head slightly, like she was trying to process a math problem that kept coming out wrong. What she didn't know, what I'd arranged through Robert 4 weeks earlier, was that the equity in our jointly titled home, our two investment accounts totaling just over $340,000, and the vacation property in Michigan had all been restructured through a family trust 12 months ago. The named beneficiaries were our two children, ages 19 and 22. Lydia retained her right to live in the home through the trust terms. She didn't lose the roof over her head, but she couldn't liquidate it, couldn't leverage it, couldn't use it as a counterweight in any legal proceeding. She found out about the trust from Dennis after the hearing. I wasn't there for that conversation, but Robert told me Dennis had called him afterward, not angry, just quiet. Your client, Dennis had said, plays a long game. Robert had replied, that's what happens when you spend 20 years building things for people who don't bother to look at the foundation. The hearing concluded in 94 minutes. Every motion Dennis filed was reviewed calmly and dismissed on documentation. The reversion clause held. The financial claims were waived by me and therefore moot. The divorce was uncontested in substance, only in delay. Walking out, Lydia's voice caught me at the top of the courthouse steps. "Carter," she said it the way you say a word you've repeated so many times it started to lose its shape. I stopped and turned. The January air was sharp, the kind that makes everything look very clear and very cold at the same time. "You didn't have to take everything," she said. Not accusatory, just worn down to something that was almost honest. I looked at her steadily. "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine to take, Lydia, and I left everything that was yours untouched." She opened her mouth, closed it. The wind moved past us both. "Blake is cooperating with the IRS," I added, not unkindly. "Get ahead of it. Get a tax attorney, not Dennis. Someone who specializes in compliance. You still have time to manage this better than you've managed everything else." I didn't wait for a response. I walked down the steps, got into my truck, and drove back to the office. It was the last time I spoke to her directly. 8 months after I walked out of that house with one duffel bag, a Columbus Business Journal ran a short feature on Groundwork Leadership's expansion into corporate training contracts across 4 Midwest states. The article mentioned their new curriculum director, Joel Tanner, formerly of a regional coaching brand, and their silent early-stage investor whose identity the company had declined to disclose. I read it over coffee on a Thursday morning and felt nothing in particular. Not pride, not nostalgia. Just the clean recognition that something I'd helped set in motion was running well on its own. Patricia Hale had built something real. Joel was thriving. The clients who transitioned from Elevate Her were receiving better service than they'd had before. The market had corrected itself, the way markets do when someone removes a layer of performance and replaces it with substance. Ellison Advisory Group had formally rebranded as Ellison Logistics Consulting. Cleaner name, cleaner scope. We'd taken on 2 new regional distribution clients in the fourth quarter, and the revenue numbers were the strongest in 7 years. Mara had hired 2 additional support staff and was managing the administrative side with the same no-questions efficiency that had made her indispensable for a decade. Brian Thatcher had left 2 voicemails in the months following the divorce. I listened to both and returned neither. There was nothing in them worth responding to, no accountability, just the particular social discomfort of a man who'd gotten away with something and couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or guilty about it. Either way, that was his to carry. Blake Fenwick had entered into a cooperation agreement with the IRS in exchange for reduced penalties on the BF Strategic Resources transaction records. The formal assessment was still pending, but Robert had confirmed that Lydia was now working with a tax compliance attorney, which was the advice I'd given her on the courthouse steps, whether she wanted to hear it from me or not. The detail that surfaced publicly, and that I hadn't planned for, came through a community newsletter from a veteran support organization on the east side of Columbus. They ran a quarterly donor acknowledgement, and someone on their board, apparently moved by the recent coverage of the Groundwork story, had decided the time was right to thank their largest anonymous contributor of the past 4 years by name. They spelled it correctly. Carter T. Ellison. The contribution total over 4 years was listed as $47,000. I got 12 calls that week from people who said they hadn't known. My response was the same each time. The work the organization did mattered, the anonymity had been intentional, and I was glad the families they serve were getting what they needed. One of those calls was from my son, Ryan, a 22-year-old who was finishing his last year of college and had apparently seen the newsletter on a community Facebook page. "Dad," he said, in that particular tone young men use when they're surprised by their fathers in a good way and don't quite know what to do with it. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because it wasn't about me," I replied. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm proud of you." I let that sit where it landed. On a Friday evening in early March, I drove out to the east side and stood outside the Veterans Center for a few minutes. Not for any particular reason, just to see the building. The lights were on inside. Through the window, I could see a group of men around a table, laughing at something, a card game or a story, one of them gesturing with both hands. I stood there long enough to feel the cold through my jacket, then got back in the truck. Some things you build for the photograph. Some things you build because the work itself is the point, and the building is its own reward, and you never needed anyone to notice because you always knew exactly what you were doing and why. I drove home through the dark Columbus streets, past the freight yards I'd built my business on, past the office park where Ellison Advisory's lights were off for the weekend, past the neighborhood where I used to live. I didn't slow down when I passed the house. There was nothing there that still belonged to me, and nothing I wanted back. The road ahead was open, and I knew exactly where it went.
You know what I keep thinking about after this story? Carter never needed anyone to see what he was doing or why. He built things quietly, he gave generously without asking for credit, and when the moment came, he didn't destroy anyone. He simply stopped holding up a structure that was never appreciated. That's not revenge. That's a man finally choosing himself. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.